Arab millionaire kicks out wife and son. What happens when he finds a mysterious cabin will shock you. Hook. What if everything you've ever known, everything you've ever loved, was suddenly ripped away, leaving you to face an unimaginable darkness? This story is about a man who thought he could escape his past, only to discover that no one truly escapes fate. Will he find redemption or be consumed by the very darkness he tried to outrun? Watch till the end to uncover the shocking truth that changes everything. The mansion door slammed shut behind him. His chest heaved with anger. His wife and son, standing outside, watched in stunned silence. He couldn't believe it. He had finally had enough. The money, the power, none of it had ever been enough. They were weak, he thought, and they would never understand. He turned, leaving them behind. The drive was long. The night was thick with shadows. When he arrived at his cabin, it felt like a different world. A small, forgotten place, hidden away in the forest. No servants, no luxury, just silence, the kind of silence that swallowed you whole. He stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. The cabin loomed ahead, its dark windows like eyes staring back at him. He had bought it years ago for a quiet retreat, but tonight it felt different, empty. He stood there for a moment, his breath heavy in the cold air. The wind howled through the trees, distant and eerie. The door creaked as he opened it. He stepped inside. The floorboards groaned beneath his feet. Everything was covered in dust. No warmth, just cold. It smelled of wood, of something long forgotten. He flicked on the light, but the bulb flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. There was a chair by the fireplace, old and worn. He sank into it, his mind racing. Images of his wife and son flashed before him. The anger surged again, but then there was something else. A faint noise from the back of the cabin. A movement. A whisper. His eyes darted to the doorway. Nothing. He tried to ignore it, but the hairs on his neck stood up. The wind had stopped. It was too quiet. A creak echoed from behind him. He spun around, his heart pounding. The room was empty. No one there. Yet, something felt wrong. He could feel it, like eyes watching him from the shadows. He stood slowly, his hands trembling. The air grew colder. And then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. He froze. It wasn't his voice, but it sounded like his wife. No, it couldn't be. His heart raced, a pulse in his ears. The voice whispered again, more insistent now. Closer. He turned, his pulse a drumbeat in his chest. The light flickered again, and in the brief moment of darkness, he saw something. A figure in the corner of the room, pale, shrouded. It didn't move, but it was there, and it was watching him. His breath caught in his throat. His legs felt like lead. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The figure stepped forward, slowly, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He stumbled back, and then the room went cold. So cold he could see his breath. The figure didn't speak, but somehow he knew. It wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real, and it had been waiting for him. The figure moved closer. Each step was deliberate. Its eyes never left his. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing in. His chest tightened. He wanted to run, but his feet were frozen to the floor. The figure reached out, its fingers long and pale. His breath caught, a cold wave washing over him. It didn't touch him, not yet, but he could feel its presence, like a dark cloud hanging over him. The air grew thicker, harder to breathe. The whisper came again, louder now, clearer. It sounded like a warning, a plea. "Get out," it said, the voice trembling. He shook his head, struggling to focus. "Get out before it's too late," it repeated. The figure's form flickered, like a candle struggling against the wind. Then, suddenly, it vanished. The room returned to stillness. Silence. He stood there, his heart pounding in his ears. Was it a dream? He glanced around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But the cold lingered. The fear clung to him. Then something shifted. The door to the cabin slammed shut, rattling the entire structure. He jumped, spinning toward it. A sudden gust of wind howled, and the lights flickered again. For a moment, everything was dark. Then, a new sound, a scratching, faint but distinct, like nails on wood. It came from the floorboards, slow, rhythmic. He took a step back, his pulse racing. It was coming closer, closer. With each scratch, the floor seemed to shudder beneath him. He turned toward the fireplace, desperately looking for anything to defend himself. But the room was empty. The fire had died long ago. The scratching stopped. The silence returned. But something else was there now. A feeling. It was in the air. Heavy. Unforgiving. And then the lights flickered one last time. And in that brief flash, he saw her, his wife, standing in the doorway, her eyes wide, filled with terror, her lips moving, but no sound. He opened his mouth to call out, but she didn't move. Instead, she reached out a hand, a final warning. But before he could take a step toward her, the lights went out completely, and in the darkness, a voice. This time, it was his son. "Help us," it whispered. "Please help us." The darkness pressed in, suffocating him. His heart hammered in his chest. "Help us." The words echoed in his ears, a distant cry. His son's voice, filled with fear. But where were they? He stumbled forward, reaching out blindly. The cold seemed to grow colder with each step. His breath came in shallow gasps. He knew they couldn't be here. Not really. But that voice, it sounded so real. "Please." The voice trembled again, closer now. He turned, desperately searching the shadows. Nothing. The cabin seemed to be closing in on him. The walls seemed to press tighter, the air too thick to breathe. Then a creak, a door swinging open. The sound came from behind him. His eyes snapped to the source. The door at the far end of the room had swung wide, and through the opening he saw it. The figure of his wife again, standing just outside. But something was wrong. Her skin was pale, almost translucent. Her eyes were hollow, drained of life. She reached toward him with a hand that trembled, her fingers long and skeletal. "Get out." She whispered again, but this time it was different. The voice wasn't hers anymore. It was darker, like something else had taken her place. He took a step backward, his pulse racing. But he couldn't look away. The air in the room was now ice cold, a chill that seeped into his bones. The whispering grew louder. It was coming from all sides. The voice of his wife, of his son. "Help us. Get out." It was all wrong. He turned and fled toward the door, his footsteps loud in his ears. But as he reached for the handle, it slammed shut on its own, trapping him, trapped in the cabin with the voices. The walls seemed to be closing in, growing tighter, suffocating. His breaths grew ragged, his vision blurry from fear. He spun around, looking for another way out. But every door was locked, every window shut tight. He was trapped. A figure moved from the corner of the room, slowly, deliberate, a shadow. It moved toward him with a terrifying quietness. The figure's face, no, not a face. More like a mask of darkness, formed only by shadows. It wasn't his wife anymore. It wasn't his son. It was something far worse. And as it reached for him, his blood ran cold. The darkness seemed to swallow the room whole. And then, a scream. It was his. But it didn't sound like him. It was hollow, distant, like it was coming from somewhere far, far away. And then everything went silent, except for the whisper. Too late. It came from everywhere. Too late, the whisper lingered in the air, echoing in his skull. Too late, his entire body froze, every muscle locked in terror. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The darkness pressed harder, suffocating him. For a moment, he thought he might faint. His vision was spinning, and his heart felt like it was about to explode. But then, a crack in the silence. A door creaked open, just a sliver. The sound was sharp, piercing, cutting through the tension like a knife. The shadow in the room, it shifted. He turned toward it, his mind screaming to run, but his body refused. The figure moved, slow and deliberate. It took one step forward, then another. He could barely make out the shape in the darkness. It was close now. The air was thick, with an unbearable cold. He could hear his own breath, shallow and panicked, in the stillness. The figure stopped just in front of him. He could feel its presence, its eyes, though he couldn't see them, staring into him. A shiver ran down his spine. Then, the air around him shifted. The smell of decay, of rot. The figure's mouth opened. A low, guttural sound spilled from it, like a growl mixed with a whisper. Too late. The words came again, but this time they weren't spoken. They were felt, in his chest, in his soul. The figure moved closer, the temperature dropping so sharply that he could see his breath in the air. It reached for him, a hand that was no longer human, but something other. It brushed his cheek, cold like ice. And then, his skin burned. A hot, searing pain spread across his face, his neck, his chest. He screamed, his voice tearing from his throat. But it didn't help. The pain was unbearable. It spread, consuming him. He couldn't see anymore, just the heat, the searing, unrelenting heat that crushed him from the inside out. The figure's grip tightened, its fingers sinking into his flesh. Too late. It hissed again. His body trembled, his hands clawing at the figure's cold arm, but it was too strong, too cold. He could feel the darkness wrapping around him, pulling him under. His vision blurred, everything fading into nothingness. The last thing he heard before the darkness took him completely, a laugh, low, hollow, and endless. Then silence. No more whisper, no more pain, just the cold, the deep, eternal cold. And then, nothing. I and the void. There was only stillness. No sound, no light, just an endless, suffocating darkness that seemed to stretch on forever. He couldn't tell if he was alive or dead. The weight of it was crushing, yet strange. He felt no pain now, no fear, just the eerie quiet. Then, a shift, a faint sound, distant at first, like a breeze through the trees. The quiet was broken, but it was a hollow sound, empty, far away. The air around him trembled, as if something was stirring, something watching. His senses returned slowly. He could feel the cold again, but it wasn't the freezing cold from before. It was different. It felt familiar. He blinked, and the darkness was gone. No walls, no shadows. Instead, there was only a dim, flickering light. He was standing now. The ground beneath him was soft, like earth. His feet sank slightly into the dirt as he took a step forward. A sound reached him, footsteps, slow, deliberate. And then a figure appeared before him. It was a man, tall and thin, with hollow eyes that stared right through him. The figure didn't speak, but the air grew heavy as he approached. The figure's lips curled into a twisted smile, and then a voice, not a whisper, but something clear, something direct. "You wanted the truth," it said, the words hanging thick in the air. The man's voice was low, unsettling, like a forgotten memory. He tried to speak, to ask where he was, but no words came. Instead, he was pulled toward the figure, drawn forward, as if the very earth was pulling him closer. "You thought you were in control," the figure continued, his eyes dark like the void. You thought your wealth could protect you. A laugh escaped the man's lips, cruel and cold. You were wrong. The world around him seemed to warp, shifting. He could see flashes, his wife's terrified face, his son's desperate plea. But they were gone as quickly as they appeared. Now, you are part of this, the figure said. A part of something far greater than you ever imagined. The ground beneath him began to crack open, revealing a darkness so deep that it swallowed everything. The man stepped aside, and the earth split wide, opening into an abyss. He could hear it now, voices echoing from below, whispers, screams. It was the sound of those who had come before him, those who had fallen into the same trap. You will never escape, the figure said, his voice full of dark satisfaction. And as the darkness pulled him in, the last thing he saw was the cold smile of the figure, his hollow eyes watching, waiting. Then, nothing, the abyss swallowed him whole, a suffocating darkness that seemed endless. He couldn't see, couldn't feel. Time had no meaning. He was weightless, floating in an eternal void. But then, a flicker, a glimmer of light pierced the blackness. It was faint at first, like the distant glow of a dying star. But it grew brighter, sharper, and with it came a feeling, a pull, a tugging sensation that yanked at him. Deep inside, the darkness around him began to stir, swirling. The light was growing, closer, closer. It was beckoning him. He reached out instinctively, his body moving toward it, though he had no control. The light grew, enveloping him, flooding his senses. And suddenly, he was no longer floating. He was standing again, his feet firm on the ground. The world around him was no longer empty. It was a forest. Tall trees loomed overhead, their branches heavy with dark leaves. The air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. The ground beneath him was damp, soft with moss. The light came from somewhere above, barely breaking through the canopy, casting a sickly glow across the landscape. It felt wrong. It felt like a prison. The silence was unbearable. But then a sound broke it. A whisper, low, familiar. His name. Get out. It was his wife's voice. Her voice, but distorted. He turned, looking for her, but saw nothing. Just the trees, stretching endlessly, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The whisper came again. Get out. He stumbled forward, his legs weak, every step heavy with the weight of fear. But the forest seemed to close in on him. The path before him twisted, spiraling deeper into the woods. And then he saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. A woman, his wife. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but there was something in them now, something hollow, empty. She was calling to him, her lips moving, but no sound came. Please, she mouthed, but the air was thick with a suffocating silence. He tried to move toward her, but his feet refused to cooperate. It was as if the ground was pulling him back, dragging him toward something far darker. He glanced down, and that's when he saw it. The earth beneath him was cracking, splitting open, revealing something beneath. Something that wasn't just dirt, a darkness that shifted and churned. It wasn't the void. It was worse. A gaping mouth of shadows, ready to consume him whole. The trees around him began to shake, their roots reaching up like tendrils, grasping at his ankles. The whisper came again, louder now. Too late. And then the ground gave way. He fell into the depths of the darkness. And the last thing he heard was the sound of his wife's voice. Help us. But it was too late. The darkness swallowed him, a force so strong that it felt like his very soul was being torn apart. The fall seemed endless, a free fall into an abyss where time no longer existed. The air was thick, suffocating. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last. but the sound was swallowed by the crushing silence. And then, a jolt. He hit the ground hard. But it wasn't solid earth. It was soft, like the surface of water. He gasped, struggling to breathe. The darkness remained around him, but it wasn't as complete as before. There was a faint, flickering light, like a distant fire, that barely illuminated the space. He forced himself to his hands and knees, his body trembling. The air smelled of something rotten, like decaying wood and damp earth. The ground beneath him was wet, sticky. He looked down, his eyes wide with panic. His hands were covered in black tar-like substance, thick and clinging to his skin. A low, guttural growl vibrated through the ground, sending a chill down his spine. It was coming from all around him. The ground shook again, harder this time, as if something massive was moving just beneath the surface. And then, a sound, a voice. It was faint at first, but it grew clearer with each passing second. "Help us." His eyes snapped to the source. A figure was emerging from the shadows. A woman, but not his wife. Her face was warped, distorted. Her eyes, once wide with fear, were now hollow, empty sockets that stared into him with a hollow despair. Her mouth opened, and the whisper escaped. "Get out, it's too late for you." He scrambled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. But the more he moved, the closer she came. She was crawling toward him now, dragging herself across the sticky ground. Her hands were outstretched, fingers bent at unnatural angles, scraping along the dirt, leaving trails of that same black substance. "Too late," she rasped, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. He couldn't move. His body was frozen with terror. And then, the ground beneath him cracked open, splitting wide, revealing more of the same twisting darkness. The woman's mouth stretched unnaturally wide, a scream escaping, but it was a sound that didn't belong to her. It was the sound of something far older, far more terrifying. The darkness beneath him seemed to pulse, a living entity, hungry. The woman lunged toward him, her face contorted in a grotesque grin, the black liquid dripping from her eyes. He tried to scream, but the air was thick with dread, stifling him. The last thing he felt was her cold fingers wrapping around his wrist. And then, the darkness consumed him once more. But this time, there was no light to escape to. No whispers, no breath, only the suffocating, relentless void, and the feeling of being lost. Forever did I end that suffocating void. There was no escape, no sound, no sensation, just the unrelenting, crushing pressure of the darkness pressing in from all sides. His mind felt like it was splitting in two. Every inch of his body was numb, weighed down by a force so heavy he could hardly keep his thoughts together. It was as if time itself had stopped. But then, a flicker, a pulse of light. It was faint at first, like a heartbeat that couldn't be heard, but it grew stronger, brighter. He could feel it in the air, an electric charge, a warmth. The warmth he hadn't felt in what felt like eternity. The space around him seemed to stretch, shifting, bending in ways that shouldn't have been possible. And then, a voice. Not the whispering darkness, but something else. Familiar, his wife's voice. "Please." He didn't know where it came from. It was soft, desperate, but clear. "Help us. Please." He wasn't sure if he was dreaming or if he had truly heard her, but it felt real. It felt like it was coming from somewhere deep, somewhere distant, yet so close, like she was right beside him. The warmth grew, and for the first time since his fall, he felt his body stir. His hands twitched. His fingers, numb and stiff, slowly began to move. The void around him seemed to recede, the darkness pulling back, just for a moment. A crack in the dam, and with it, a rush of sound, a voice, but not his wife's this time. A deep, guttural tone that came from somewhere far beyond him. You should never have come. It rumbled through his bones, shaking him to his core. It wasn't the woman. It wasn't the figure of his wife. This voice was ancient, full of wrath and hunger. He could feel it now, closing in, like a beast waiting to devour him. A sudden pull yanked him downward, deeper into the abyss. His hands shot out, desperately grabbing at anything, but there was nothing to hold on to. The light was gone again. The warmth was nothing more than a fleeting memory. He was falling, but not through empty space. He could feel the ground beneath him now, slippery, shifting. It was alive. The walls were closing in. A strange, pulsing rhythm echoed around him. The heartbeat, a pulse that wasn't his. The coldness of it, like ice running through his veins. He gasped for air, but it was thick with a foul, choking mist that burned in his lungs. And then, a whisper. Too late. The words surrounded him, vibrating in his skull, breaking through his thoughts. A laugh echoed in the darkness, low, dark, and final. It was over. No escape, no light, no mercy. The darkness had claimed him, for good, and he knew then, too late. The laugh echoed, reverberating through every part of him, as if it had taken root in his very bones. It was not a sound of joy, but of something darker, older, something that had witnessed the fall of so many before him. He tried to scream, but the darkness swallowed the sound whole. His throat burned with the effort, but no voice emerged. The pulse around him, that strange heartbeat, began to quicken, faster now. The air grew heavier, suffocating, pressing in on all sides, constricting his chest until he could barely breathe. And then, the light flickered again, brief, faint, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to send a wave of desperation through him. He reached out instinctively, reaching for the light, craving anything that felt real, anything that felt like hope. His fingers scraped against something solid, rough, cold stone. He pulled himself up, desperate to move, his limbs trembling with the effort. The heartbeat grew louder, faster, like the sound of something approaching. Something big, something alive. His hands scrambled over the stone, searching, until they found a crack, a gap, a way out. But the ground beneath him trembled. The walls of the abyss seemed to shift, as if they were alive, moving, tightening their grip. He yanked himself forward, but the crack was narrow, and the pull of the darkness was relentless, dragging him back. The voice came again, this time clearer, more urgent. Too late. It was all around him now. The sound of it pressing against his skin, his mind, suffocating him from every direction. He pulled harder, every muscle in his body screaming with pain, but he couldn't stop. He couldn't give in. Not yet. His fingers found something else, something sharp and jagged, a shard of stone. He grasped it, using it to wedge himself deeper into the crack, his body scraping against the rough surface. But the pain was nothing compared to the horror he felt. The heartbeat grew louder, nearer. Something was coming. He could feel it. The crack widened just enough. A sliver of light broke through, blinding him, and for the first time in what felt like forever, he saw something, anything, other than the all-encompassing void. He forced his body through, inch by agonizing inch, until, a jolt, a force pulled him forward, and suddenly he was tumbling, falling again, but this time it wasn't the endless, crushing dark. This time he fell into a strange, cold expanse. He landed hard on the ground, gasping for breath. The air was thick with an unnatural chill, but it wasn't suffocating. He pushed himself up, his mind still reeling, still caught in the grip of the terror he had just escaped. He looked around, trying to understand where he was. The landscape before him was barren. Twisted trees, skeletal and dry, stretched toward a blood-red sky. The ground beneath him was cracked, broken, like it had been scorched by some terrible force. and in the distance he saw it. A shape, a silhouette, the figure of a man standing still watching him. His heart skipped a beat. Could it be? His legs trembled, but he forced himself to stand. The man turned slowly, and as he did, the shadows around him seemed to shift, swirling as if alive. The man's face was obscured by a hood, but there was something in his stance, something cold and powerful about him. He felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but something else, too, a strange pull. The man didn't speak at first, just standing there, his presence like a weight pressing against the very air around him. Then, finally, a voice. Not his wife's, not his son's, but a voice that felt as old as the earth itself. You thought you could escape. The words sent a chill down his spine. The ground trembled again, and he could feel the pull of the darkness, still lingering, still waiting for him. You never left, the figure continued. You were always part of this. And then, the world around him cracked open once more. This time, there was no escape. The crack in the world grew wider, as if the very earth was tearing apart beneath him. The figure before him remained still, unblinking, as if watching the destruction unfold with a sense of inevitable satisfaction. The ground beneath him started to sink, pulling him down like the roots of a dying tree. He tried to step back, but the earth had become soft and unstable, shifting beneath his weight. A low rumble echoed through the air, growing louder, the sound of the abyss below him stretching wide, opening up like a yawning mouth. "Please, no," he whispered to himself, his voice trembling with the desperation of someone who had already lost everything. The figure stepped forward, its dark silhouette casting long shadows over the cracked earth. "You think you can escape fate." The figure's voice was like thunder, its depth filling the entire space, vibrating through his chest. "But you never truly left. You're already marked, just like all who came before you." The man's heart pounded in his chest, but his legs refused to move. He felt the cold, clammy grip of fear tighten around him, freezing his limbs. The abyss beneath him whispered a low, hissing sound, and he could feel the darkness calling to him, pulling him closer to its edge. "Run," he muttered under his breath, trying to summon any ounce of strength. But his feet felt like lead, cemented to the ground. He turned his gaze back to the figure, its eyes still hidden beneath the hood, but the darkness around it pulsed, as if it were breathing. Why is this happening?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the growing tremors of the earth. The figure tilted its head just slightly, as if considering him. "Why?" the figure repeated, its voice carrying a mocking tone. "It's always the same. You wanted to play God. You wanted to be above it all. But there is no escape from the consequences." The air thickened around him, a pressure that was both suffocating and overwhelming. He could hear the faint whispers again, voices, distant yet close, all calling to him in a chorus of despair. His wife, his son, all the faces that had haunted him. They all seemed to be screaming now, screaming for him, but not in the way he remembered. It was as if they were calling him to join them, down into the depths, into the darkness he had tried to flee. And then the ground beneath his feet crumbled, faster this time. He fell, tumbling into the dark void once again. But this time, there was no pulse of light to save him, no flicker of hope, just the suffocating darkness closing in on all sides. His body hit something soft, cold, like the surface of water, but it didn't feel like water at all. He was submerged, but he didn't drown. The blackness surrounded him, suffocating him, pulling him under, but he couldn't move. And then the voice came again, not from the figure, but from all around him. Too late. The words wrapped around him, curling through his mind like a final, deadly embrace. He wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but there was nothing to fight against, no way to escape. The figure's voice echoed in his mind, clearer than ever. "You were always a part of this. Your fate was sealed the moment you crossed the threshold. The ground below him seemed to shift again, but now it wasn't just the earth. It was alive. The darkness around him pulled him closer, closer to the thing he could feel, but could not see. A presence that lurked just beyond his reach. And then, a sudden flash of light. For a brief moment he saw it. A face. His wife's face, contorted in agony, staring at him through the darkness. Her mouth moved, but no sound came. Her eyes, filled with sorrow, locked onto his, and in that brief instant he saw it, the truth. He had never been in control. He had never been free. And as the darkness closed in around him once more, he realized there was no escaping what he had done. There was no escape from what he had become. And as the abyss claimed him once again, he finally understood. Too late to undo what was done. The darkness closed in around him like a suffocating blanket, the air thick with dread. His chest tightened as if the very atmosphere was crushing his lungs. Every movement felt like it was being fought by the weight of the world. He tried to scream, to fight, but his voice was lost in the void, absorbed by the oppressive silence. The pulse of the heartbeat grew louder again, faster, the rhythm of something ancient, something unforgiving. His head swam, his thoughts spiraling into chaos as the shadows pressed in tighter. He tried to move, but it was as if his body no longer belonged to him, frozen in place by an invisible force. Then, a flicker of light, so small, so brief, that for a moment he thought it was a trick of his exhausted mind. But no, there it was again, a glimmer, like the last desperate flicker of a dying star, cutting through the pitch-black void. He strained toward it, desperate for it, feeling its pull, as if it could be his salvation. But the ground beneath him quaked, the earth trembling violently, and suddenly the darkness shifted. Something moved in the shadows, something enormous, its presence suffocating the air. The figure emerged from the blackness. It was the man, the one who had haunted him since his fall, the figure who had watched him with that cold, knowing smile. His face was still hidden beneath the hood, but the darkness around him seemed to swirl with an unnatural energy, as if the figure itself were part of the abyss. "You should never have tried to run," the figure said, its voice a deep growl, vibrating through the very core of him. The man's eyes gleamed from within the hood. There was no kindness, no pity there, only something ancient and predatory. "You were always meant to be here," the figure continued. "The darkness doesn't forgive. It doesn't forget." And then, in the briefest of moments, the man reached out, his fingers long, pale, and cold as they brushed against his skin. The moment their touch connected, he felt it. The weight of all the choices he had made, all the lives he had ruined, the things he had discarded. It was too late for regret, too late for redemption. The darkness surged forward, swallowing him whole, dragging him into the abyss where there would be no escape. And as the last traces of light flickered out, he realized the truth. This was his fate, and it was sealed. Forever the darkness began to pull away, as if yielding to an unseen force, a slow retreat that felt almost gentle, deceptive in its calmness. He couldn't understand it. After all he had endured, all the fear, the pain, the suffocating terror, he was still here, still standing in the remnants of a world that no longer seemed real. The heartbeat had stopped, the rhythm fading into nothing, leaving a silence that felt both oppressive and peaceful. And then, the light. Not the flickering, faint, desperate flashes of before, but a steady, soft glow, like the first light of dawn breaking through the heavy clouds. The space around him began to shift. The darkness didn't vanish entirely, but it receded, drawn away by the warmth of the light. He stood still, almost afraid to move, afraid that if he did, it would all disappear. But it didn't. It stayed. The ground beneath his feet solidified, no longer shifting or breaking apart. The air felt lighter, almost refreshing, like a breath after years of suffocation. He turned slowly, his eyes scanning the world around him. The forest, once dark and oppressive, now seemed alive, full of life. The trees, though still twisted and ancient, no longer reached out to trap him. Instead, they stood tall, rooted in a strange peace. And there, in the distance, he saw them, his wife, his son. They were standing together, not in the terror he had imagined, but in a place of quiet serenity. Their faces weren't filled with fear or anger, but something else, understanding, maybe forgiveness. His wife's eyes met his, her gaze soft. She didn't speak, but there was no need to. He felt something lift from his chest, an unbearable weight easing into nothingness. The figure, the man who had tormented him, was gone. And the abyss, that endless pit of darkness that had consumed him, no longer existed. For the first time since everything had fallen apart, he felt something within him change. Something subtle, but profound. It wasn't escape. It wasn't a return to the way things had been, but it was peace. A slow realization bloomed in his chest. It was over, not because the darkness had been vanquished, but because he had finally accepted it. The consequences, the past, the things he could never undo, they were now a part of him. And with that acceptance, the world around him settled. His journey had come full circle, not in redemption or revenge, but in a quiet, inevitable truth. It was time to move forward, and as the light wrapped around him, he took one final step into the unknown. But this time, he wasn't afraid. This time, he was free.